My name is Mary Lynn Podiluk. I am a Saskatoon-based art jeweler and goldsmith, and I have had a studio practice here in Saskatoon since 2012 when I returned from Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I graduated at NSCAD University with a degree in jewelry design and metalsmithing. Here I am the curator for this lovely exhibition of Melody Armstrong's contemporary jewelry, and she asked me to take on this role, and it was a great opportunity. I have been familiar with Melody's work for a little while. When I was still living in Halifax, I had decided to look at who in Saskatchewan might be a practicing art jeweler or someone who is making contemporary jewelry, because I had decided to move back. And her name popped up a lot. I could definitely tell when I was looking into it that she had been or is one of the pioneers in the art jewelry field here in Saskatchewan, and I was eager to meet her, which I had the opportunity to do last spring. I visited the Neil Balkwell Center for a little brief period, and she happened to be teaching a class, and so we got to introduce ourselves to each other and kind of start a dialogue between each other about our practice and our work. And later on in that year, so that would have been late summer, we got to spend a lot of time together at the Emma International Collaboration up at the Ness Creek Festival site. And yeah, we got to make jewelry outside together for a good portion of a week, which is a blast. Melody and I speak a very similar vocabulary because we have a similar background. We're working within the same field. So there was never really a point where what I was talking about was unclear to her or vice versa. And in that regard, we were able to discuss the technical side of things, the technical side of making, and those processes that she was really pushing herself to explore. And I urged her to push it further. You know, consider how the metal would move this way, or consider what if you bent it this way or this way. And so as a curator, I kind of tried to help her think about these processes. And when it came time to work on her statement, it was really fun to give her feedback on how she wanted to articulate what this body of work was about, the processes, the materials, the aesthetic. And together, when installing the work in the gallery space, it was fun to have that back and forth about which pieces looked suitable together in certain cases, and really highlighting that process that I was talking about prior to show the progression of the technical ways that the pieces developed and their appearances and aesthetics. This exhibition of Melody's work can really show the focus that she had with making the work. She definitely was looking to expand her technical repertoire, and so she experimented a lot during the making process. And I think it's very interesting that I can see that progression, and I really invite viewers to look for that as well, because it kind of dives into the making process and how all of these pieces are hand fabricated. It highlights the constructive and very deliberate nature of her work. And from that, you can really see a lot of repeating elements, whether they're obvious or not necessarily obvious. They might be a little bit more subtle, such as like her handmade chain. Each and every chain is hand fabricated. None of this is factory produced. To further elaborate on the detailing of each chain, I think it's important to point out some of these small nuances that show up differently per chain. Here you might look at the piece and think, well, that is a standard cable chain with interconnecting rings. However, if you look more closely, every other jump ring has a unique characteristic in that it's not just simply joined, but rather there's two small little balls that create the jump ring. And I think that this is really distinct in Melody's work, that she really focuses on this chain making. Here's another example of a chain that is different than the previous in that it emphasizes a slightly more geometric element. In this piece here, we're looking at a more pentagon shape, and you can see that it is indeed flexible, which makes it chain-like, but you wouldn't see this sort of chain on any piece of jewelry. This is truly a unique, one-of-a-kind chain that creates this piece as a whole. It's not simply a a chain that a pendant hangs on. It becomes kind of part of the work itself and highlights kind of the elaborate nature of jewelry making. With this piece, the viewer may question, well, how do I put it on? You know, it doesn't quite fit over the head. It has what's called a box catch, which is fairly labor intensive to fabricate by hand. Here you would just simply push this small button and it releases a spring mechanism on the inside that keeps the piece together. And what I like is that instead of the catch being in the back of the piece, which is normal, she's actually made the catch become the focal point of the piece. Art jewelry might not be a term people around here are familiar with. It's also tricky to describe or define because it doesn't have the centuries of tradition that certain fine craft or fine art might have. But that's not to say it's not relevant. About 60 or 70 years ago, it's a movement that emerged with post-war prosperity throughout Europe and the United States. And from there have been a few other subgenres. So art jewelry would be like the umbrella term for contemporary jewelry, which is what you see here today, or modern jewelry. Studio jewelry might be other terms you have heard. All of those, they're not the same thing as like fine jewelry or fashion jewelry, which are more about making a fashion statement or a personal statement, or even becoming more of a status symbol. One might describe art jewelry to be a critique on the precious nature of jewelry itself, kind of liberating it from the restrictive nature of value through use of alternative materials. Not necessarily only alternative materials, but juxtaposing, let's say, alternative materials against those precious materials, it allows the viewer to consider what could be precious, not necessarily that inherent value, but thinking about the conceptual value of the work. It really focuses on emphasizing innovation and experimentation and expression of the artist rather than just being a piece of adornment. These pieces demonstrate how Melody really started with an initial concept and proceeded to have another piece that could follow easily from it through the techniques she employed. So in the case of this neck piece here, you can see there's some negative space within each link. And what she's done is then taken those pieces and created this piece from them. And this might not be initially apparent to the viewer because she's also repeated them to create a slightly more organic form. And I think that's really interesting to highlight how her process developed in this body of work. This piece features an interesting clasp as well, and it's not obvious at first, but this pin here, it's a slightly longer pin, and it pushes out and allows the two ends to come apart. And each of these little mechanisms feature a little gemstone on the tip, which is fun. One might say that art jewelry has the tradition of being non-traditional through its context of using these alternative materials and being conceptual or challenging the viewer and challenging the wearer in a way that is non-traditional. Here in Saskatchewan, we don't see much art jewelry. There aren't many makers who are specifically focusing on art jewelry or making contemporary jewelry, and it's really nice to see this exhibition space full of such work. And I hope that in this light we start to have more focus and start to educate people on how this jewelry is different from the jewelry you might see elsewhere throughout the province that is simply for adornment rather than specifically making these artistic statements and explorations and focusing on work that is handmade. Melody had a definite aesthetic that she was going for when developing this body of work. It was really informed by the materials, however, and through the materials and through working with metal with her hands, she came to making these beautiful pieces of contemporary jewelry that are bold and daring, and kind of they don't compromise for tradition that one might expect. And together, like seeing all the work here, it's lovely to again see that progression and view the work in a gallery space, like seeing the work in cases and under plinths. It might be equally as rewarding as putting on a piece of jewelry for the first time. And in that sense, I mean it like when you put on a piece of jewelry, there might be something about it that you overlooked or didn't think about. And in the gallery, the work is isolated from the body, and therefore it allows you to look at the work closer. You're not getting up in someone's personal space by saying, "Oh, let me see those earrings." And so you can definitely get up close and look at those details, which I really urge people to do. And again, looking and thinking about art jewelry, it's also important to consider that, again, they do look amazing on the body. The body is the canvas in this case, and I think it's interesting to appreciate those things.